I'm sitting here today with the Tennessee Holocaust Commission, proud to welcome Dr. Efraim Zuroff from Jerusalem. So, Dr. Zuroff, you are internationally acclaimed historian of the Holocaust, scholar, and you're also the director of the Sonnet Wiesenthal Center in Jerusalem. So tell me, I have read your books. I know that you had an ambition towards being an NBA player at one point. So how does a, a young man from Brooklyn, New York, who grows up as an Orthodox Jew, go from, wanting to play in the NBA to being the world's last Nazi hunter?
First of all, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't good enough to play in the NBA. But even more important was you really couldn't be an Orthodox Jew playing in the NBA. Ironically, just this last week, a student of Yeshiva College, that's my alma mater, where I played basketball as well, was drafted in the G League draft by the Detroit Pistons affiliate. And who knows, maybe he will make it to the NBA. But I don't regret it, certainly not. And basketball's loss was Nazi hunting's gain, right? I think that's a little more important than the NBA.
Absolutely, for sure. So can you tell me a little bit about where you studied it? Tell us a little bit also about like how you actually proceeded, because you were in the States initially and now you're in Jerusalem. So tell us about how you got there.
Okay, so first of all, I was educated in Orthodox Jewish institutions in elementary school, in high school, and even in college. In other words, I went to Yeshiva University, which was the only Orthodox university actually in the world. No, Bar Ilan is also it's one in Israel as well. But in the United States, it's the only Orthodox university that there is. My family, well, actually, almost all of them were employed by Yeshiva University. My grandfather was the dean of men in Yeshiva College. He was in charge of the draft. He was in charge of fundraising. He was in charge of the PR. His nickname was Mr. Yeshiva. In other words, a person who devoted his whole life to the institution and to building the institution. But along with that, he was also a very active member of the religious Zionists in America and was twice sent by the Joint Distribution Committee to Europe in 1945 and 1948 to help the survivors of the Holocaust. So, in other words, he was a person who devoted his life obviously to Orthodox causes, but also to the broader cause of the Jewish people. And he was a tremendous influence on me and on my family. And we were raised to be very Zionistic. And that's one of the things that really, you know what, I'll put it to you this way. I'm from the generation of 1967. In other words, the generation that was quite young and impressionable at the time of the Six-Day War. So I'll tell you a story that I think illustrates the whole thing. The Sunday before the Six-Day War began, I was sitting in my home in Brooklyn and reading the News of the Week in Review of the New York Times, a section of the News of the Week in Review. And there was a map in that section of the Middle East and 3 columns: soldiers, tanks, and planes. Now, on one side, there was a very long list of countries and a long list of soldiers, tanks, and planes. And on the other side was one name of a country, and it's the number of planes, tanks, and soldiers that they had. And in those days, Israel was even much smaller than it is today, incredibly vulnerable. It had a width at some point of 10 kilometers. And my reaction, and it was actually very strange, as I'll explain to you. My reaction was, oh my God, there's going to be another Holocaust. Now, why would I say that? In other words, we didn't study about the Holocaust in school. I'm named for someone who was killed in the Holocaust, but the fact that this person was a great Talmud scholar, a real genius, was more important than the fact that he'd been murdered in the house. We didn't even know how he was murdered, where he was murdered, or any of that. And it wasn't a topic. But instead of, a Holocaust, Israel won an enormous, brilliant victory, brilliant military victory. We were able to return to Judea and Samaria, the heartland of the land of Israel, and our history in the land of Israel. And returned to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, and all of that. So I was among the students who were the first ones to register for a year overseas in Hebrew University because the war had broken out in June, and the only people who would come the year right after the war were the people who had already registered, and they weren't inspired by the 6-Day War because the 6-Day War hadn't happened yet. So when the next year there was a huge rise in enrollment, and many people started coming to Israel to study. Many people started immigrating to Israel from Russia. The first wave of Russian immigrants were coming from South Africa, from South America, from Western Europe, and it was a time of incredible excitement about Israel, about Israel's future, and great, how should I put it, great pride in the fantastic victory of the Israeli Defense Force. So I spent that year in Israel, and I decided that Israel's for me, but I had to go finish my BA. So I went back to the United States, and I decided I'm going right back. And my parents were pushing me to continue my studies. I don't know if I was so anxious to do it, but anyway, so there's a Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University, and one of the specializations is the Holocaust. And I decided I knew I wanted to work with the Jewish people, so either to work in the foreign ministry or to work in the Jewish agency. So the best thing to do would be to study this contemporary Jewry, which is basically the history, demography, and sociology of the Jewish people in the 20th century. Now, but you had to choose a specialization. So when I got to Israel, all of a sudden I realized that there was nothing practical about the courses whatsoever, that it would take me 3 years to get an MA, and it actually took me 5 years. So I said I may as well choose the subject that interests me the most intellectually, which was the Holocaust. In other words, how did the Holocaust happen? How was it possible? And one of the things that I have to say is that I was very active politically, already in high school on behalf of Soviet Jewry, and even more so in college, and on behalf of Israel, on behalf of Soviet Jewry, on behalf of all the Jewish causes. And I was very, I would say, intrigued and disturbed about this business of the Holocaust and how it could happen. So if I had to spend so much time getting MA, I may as well do something that was of interest to me. And to be honest, the other subjects, in other words, the more practical thing would have been to study Eastern European Jewry, because the Russian Jews had started to come, but there were already Russian Jews there whose language was Russian. So here you have to learn it. You don't only have to learn a new language, you have to learn a new alphabet. It's Cyrillic instead of Latin letters. So that was the choice. And I started taking the courses. And when I finished the courses, I didn't get it because I didn't finish the thesis yet. So people would say to me, listen, you studied this subject, why don't you look for a job in this field? So I went to Yad Vashem, that's the Israeli National Memorial and Research Center, and I got a job as the assistant editor of Yad Vashem Studies. So that's how I started. And the day-to-day job, and most of the people there, by the way, were survivors. Almost no young people were working there. So that really got me into it, along with the fact that I had studied with the probably the most charismatic teacher and the doyen of today of Israeli of world Holocaust scholars, who was Professor Urabal. And we used to come out of his class just inspired to spend our lives studying the Holocaust and devoting our lives to teaching about the Holocaust or dealing with the Holocaust in some way. In any event, I got my MA. It was about a group of Orthodox rabbis in America, which initially was established to save only rabbis and yeshiva students, but later expanded its activity to all Jews in this, in danger. I later expanded that for a doctorate. In other words, I got approval to. I did the MA was from 39 to 43, and then I got the okay to do a doctorate. I was expanding from 39 to 43, but also and then extending it till the end of the war. Now, I had to go to America to get the documents because it's an American organization. Most important, much of the material was in the United States. There was also material in Switzerland because they had a branch in Switzerland which was very involved in a negotiation that group had with Nazi Germany, with Hitler's Walter. Now, the head of the SD in the Sicherheitsdienst, Walter Schellenberg, who was negotiating with Jewish groups on behalf of Himmler. And this story might sound crazy, and most people don't know it. There were, I think, 5 different sets of negotiations between Jewish groups and the leadership of Nazi Germany. The only thing was that Hitler never knew. And once Hitler found out about it, so he canceled it all. He wasn't willing to do it. But the idea was Hitler and others had realized that Nazi Germany was going to lose the war. So how can they save themselves? The only way they can save themselves is to convince the Western allies to team up together with them to fight against the Soviet Union. Of course, the Western allies refused to do it. But that was and what was the bait? What bait were they dangling? The Jews. The rest, those Jews remaining alive, incarcerated in Nazi concentration camps. So there were actually two trains of Jews which were rescued during that period. One of the Hungarian Jews, 1,684, which were organized by Rezo Kastner, who was the head of the Zionist Rescue Committee in Budapest. And the other one of 1,210 Jews from the Theresienstadt concentration camp, which was actually organized by these rabbis. So I got a job with the Sion Regional Center in 1978 to be like the first academic director. And they promised me they would give me time to get my documents, et cetera, et cetera. And I spent 2 years there. And then it was during those 2 years that I actually met Simon Wiesenthal. Then this first meeting actually was at Yad Vashem, where I was working before I left for LA. And I remember very distinctly that Mr. Wiesenthal was very upset that I didn't speak good German. So as this meeting went on and we started discussing various issues about the history of the Holocaust, so I realized that I knew my stuff. But in his mind, how can anyone who heads the Simon Wiesenthal Center not know perfect German? Well, that's what happened. In any event, and I got also to know Wiesenthal's story. I had no particular interest in Nazi war criminals, by the way. And so 2 things happened. One is that I met Wiesenthal, and I met him several times later in Los Angeles as well. But at that point, the United States government was about to establish the Office of Special Investigations. And even before the office was officially opened, they sent a investigator by the name of Bill Crane to meet me in Los Angeles and ask us as Sion Regional Center to endorse the work of the Office of Special Investigations so that he could go to the survivors and tell them that he was on their side. They weren't being mistreated. Like there were horrible stories of Holocaust survivors who went to Germany to testify in trials, and they were totally mistreated by the defense attorneys of the Nazis. And the experience was horrible. So And survivors in general are sometimes skeptical of government, and they don't know this was a new agency. They didn't have a track record or anything. So they wanted a Jewish organization, especially one named Efraim Zuroff, to endorse them. And of course I immediately agreed. And then I came up with this idea to set up a database of all the survivors in North America. Well, at least for you, it was a total failure because the San Luis Center didn't want to invest a penny in it. But as a result of that initiative, I was in contact with the OSI, with the Office of Special Investigations in the U.S. Justice Department, Criminal Division, who were the ones who were bringing these Nazis to justice. Now, before I went back to Israel, I was invited to a TV program at which Walter Rockland, who was the head of the OSI, was also invited. And I was a little wary because my first meeting with him, he made a terrible impression on me, I have to say. He didn't seem to know the cases. He didn't know. Anyway, we ended up sitting in a room about 1/10 the size of this room for 2 hours waiting for the interview. And I'm sitting there knowing that he knows what I said about him in the New York Times when he took over for another guy whom we liked. But anyway, I convinced him that they needed a research in Israel. Okay, so we started with a 2-month contract. And at the same time, I was doing another job because I had already agreed to do a job at the Jewish Agency. But after a few months at the Jewish Agency, I realized it would be a total waste of time. And that's, I think, was more important. And that contract was extended again and again and again for 4 months, then for 6 months, and another 6 months, and another 6 months. And actually, I worked for them 6 years. Now, what motivated me to leave the Office of Special Investigations and go back to the Wiesenthal Center and really to become a Nazi hunter was the following. 1985, the San Wiesenthal Center sent a letter, a request to the National Archives of the United States, any and all information about one Joseph Mengele. Okay? So I don't have to explain who Joseph Mengele is. The angel of death in Auschwitz, one who's notorious for the horrible experiments on twins and triplets. He was one of the doctors who made the selections, and he also had an experiment. In other words, his experiments, he tried to see to it that a situation could be created in which each German woman who got pregnant would have a multiple birth, because Germany had lost so many people during the course of the war. That was one thing. But the other thing was even crazy. By the way, all this is pseudo-scientific. It had no real scientific basis. Was that the issue of Aryan racial characteristics. In other words, blonde hair and blue eyes. Well, if you ever saw a picture of Mengele, he had brown hair and brown eyes. Maybe that's the source of his desire to see to it that every German baby would have blonde hair and blue eyes. In any event, in response to the request by the Wiesenthal Center, and I was working for the OSI at this point, a letter was received from a American counterintelligence officer who was writing to his superior. It was dated January 1947, and he informed his superior that according to information from an informant who wasn't named in the letter, but we found out who it was later, the United States Army and arrested and released Dr. Joseph Mengele near Vienna. That's nuts. That's absolutely crazy. Wiesenthal Center made a whole scandal out of it. The United States released Dr. Joseph Mengele, arrested and released Joseph Mengele. It's horrible. Okay, so William French Smith, the Attorney General at the time, made 3 decisions. 1, the United States of America will look for Joseph Mengele physically, because there was no reason for the Americans to do it until now. 2, the United States of America will investigate whether Joseph Mengele might have entered the United States, because by that time, there were thousands of Nazis that entered the United States. And 3, there'll be a historical investigation to determine whether or not this is actually true. And that's what was entrusted or, given over to the OSI. So I received an assignment to try and find David Freiman, who was the informant. Now, and the OSI had some information on him. He was a Jew from the Lodz ghetto. He was among the last people deported to Auschwitz, September of 1944. And he was sent to work in Mengeler's clinic. So he saw Mengele on a daily basis. Okay, how do you find him? I had no idea, to be honest. Then David Silberfein, who was a friend of mine, who was also a student of my father's in Brooklyn and the Yeshiva University High School of Boys from Brooklyn, he suggested that I look at something called the Alison Archives, or the International Tracing Service. Now, just to explain, the Red Cross, International Red Cross, established the International Tracing Service based on the requests that they had received from all over the world for information on people who were living in Europe during World War II, and there was no information about them. In other words, people who would write, "Where's my grandfather? Do you know what happened to my grandfather, to my uncle, to my parents?" Etc. Millions of requests, millions. And in those days, there were no databases. So it was actually a collection of more than 16 million index cards on something like 3,600 microfilms. Now, the collection was in the possession of, I think, 12 different countries. The original was in Germany, in a place called Alison, sometimes referred to as the Alison Archives, outside Frankfurt. But it was closed to anyone except first-degree relatives. The only place where there was free access to this material was in Israel, and it was at Yad Vashem. Okay, so I started looking for David Freiman, and it took me an hour, maybe more, to get the hang of it. So I'll tell you why. It wasn't organized according to a regular alphabet. It was organized according to a phonetic alphabet. Now, what does that mean? It means that double letters count as one. So in other words, I'm Zuroff, Zuroff. That's like one H. V and W have the same sound, so they're the same letter. In other words, they don't differentiate between V and W. And I, J, and Y also the same letter. Okay, so it took me about an hour to figure it out, and that's the hour that really changed my life. I'll tell you why. There was no indication on these cards whether any of these people were Nazi war criminals, okay? But I knew that these were people who were in displaced persons camps, who registered as refugees with the International Red Cross, because in order to get privileges as a refugee, you had to register with them. And there was no indication if any of them were Nazis, but what was on those cards was the immigration destinations of all these people. Now, you have to understand something. At that time, 1986, the only Anglo-Saxon country which had admitted Nazi war criminals and had decided to take legal action against them was the United States. I was working for them. Canada was investigating. Australia was investigating. Britain and New Zealand ostensibly didn't know that they had a problem. Okay? Now, what was clear to me was that this collection was an absolute goldmine of information on Nazis who escaped to the Anglo-Saxon countries, because all those 5 countries had admitted, if not thousands, at least dozens or hundreds of Nazi war criminals. And in the meantime, they hadn't been convinced to make the decision to take legal action. So I knew that while I was working for the OSI, I couldn't do anything. But if I went back to work for the Wiesenthal Center, and the Wiesenthal Center still didn't have an office in Jerusalem, and they could definitely flood these countries with the names of suspects. So I called the Rabbi Havaya, and actually I had this idea to try and set up a data bank on all the Nazi war criminals in the world, and and it would be run by the Regional Center with offices in L.A., Washington, and Jerusalem. And I hadn't heard from Rabbi White. He never answered me. Then all of a sudden, out of the blue, after I made this discovery, he says to me, you know what, Effie, I like your idea. I said, forget my idea. Let's go for the jugular. And I can give you the names of thousands of Nazis who escaped to the Anglo-Saxon countries. You're going to set up an office in Jerusalem, and I'm going to churn out the lists. He said, okay. That's actually how I became a Nazi.